We have choices. We have choices to make. Central to the management of globalization today is a willingness of the followers of Christ. We who seek to walk in his footsteps is our willingness to do just that and to engage, not disengage. Jesus didn't disengage. Jesus went into Jerusalem. Jesus went into Jerusalem. He knew what was going to happen to him. He knew, but he went into Jerusalem. And even as the people shouted and cheered and put palms at his feet, he knew where it would all end, and he still kept going on the donkey. Who are we to turn our backs? Who are we to seek to hide from the impact of the forces at work in our world today? We cannot simply leave it to others. And I have to tell you as an elected official, and it's been echoed in the contributions, and I'm just so grateful to you all for taking time out on a Sunday to be with us today. And I well understand how the pressures that exist are on all of you, and how my good friend, or new friend, the mayor of Louisville, has had to go on to yet another meeting. That's just the way it is. There are just so many pressures. But you know, those pressures are magnified day in and day out in the lives of these men. Those pressures are magnified day in and day out in the lives of the men and women who seek to take on board the responsibilities of leadership in our world by the forces of globalization, the 24-hour news cycle, the sheer speed of events. Those forces and pressures are magnified by the nature of free markets, by the nature of the movement of labor and capital and trade, in ways that no leader or set of leaders by themselves has a hope in hell, of managing. And the only way that hell can be avoided in its quite literal sense is if we all recognize that we all have a role to play. Politics is too important to be left to politicians alone. We all have a part to play. And for the love of God, we who call ourselves Christians have no other option but to engage. We have no option. This is not some sort of optional extra which we can take on board if we wish. That is not what we are told. We are told to walk humbly in the footsteps of the fishermen. We are told to walk humbly in the footsteps of the fishermen. So what's to be done? Well, let me just share some thoughts with you. I'm the grandson of a cocoa farmer from Achim in the central Ashanti region of Ghana, what was the Gold Coast. I'm the grandson of a cocoa farmer and of a printer from a place called Hoxton. So my paternal grandfather, Pa Champong, remember that? Pa Champong. That's what we called him. Well, we didn't quite call it to him to his face, but that's what we called him. And on my mum's side, printer in Hoxton, whose name, by the way, was Robert Wallace Burns Maccombie. Now, anyone called Robert Wallace Burns Maccombie, you can be sure of one thing: they've never lived in Scotland. And indeed, my grandfather never did live in Scotland, but his father lived in Scotland, and having left Scotland, he was determined that his son should be called Robert Wallace Burns Maccombie to remind him of Scotland. Now, he had fought in the First World War on the Somme with the Allies against the Kaiser, and was an air raid warden in the Second. What did I learn from these two men? I learned about faith and activism. From my maternal grandfather in particular, Robert Wallace Burns Maccombie, I particularly learned about activism in one sense, because this was a man who, having fought for his country, came back and found a country that wasn't fit for heroes, as ex-servicemen very often do, and then got sacked for his pains one Christmas Eve for being a trade union activist. He had had to leave school at 13, but he was the most educated man I knew. And I learnt my love of books and my love of activism from him. And then from Pa Champong, the cocoa farmer from Achim. From him, I learnt about faith. I learnt about faith from him. He had come as a boy under the influence of the Basel missionaries. And he had been converted as a very young man, in the face of fierce opposition locally, including opposition from members of his family. But the fetish priests, the pagan priests in Tafo, drew a line, literally, in the dust and said, "Cross this and you will die." Some people crossed and they died. They did die. Don't ever anyone tell you that the devil doesn't have power. He does, if you let him in. He has power, believe me. Some people died. My grandfather crossed. He lived, and he built a church. He built a church. He built a church. He built a church where they drew that line. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It cost him his chieftaincy, which he would have got if he'd stayed a pagan. So there was a price to be paid. There always is a price to be paid, you know. There always is a price to be paid. But he built a church, and I was christened in that church. Now, there's a story about that. Because my mum and dad didn't meet and didn't have me in the Gold Coast in Ghana. They met. He was studying law. She was a teacher in London in the 1940s. London was a very different place in the 1940s. In the 1940s, people would touch my father for luck. It was lucky to touch a black man. People would feel my father's back, kids in all innocence, would feel my father's back to see if he had a tail. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. London was very different in the 1940s. But I reckon Kentucky was very different too. I reckon Indiana was very different too. We've made some progress. We shouldn't forget that. We've made some progress because people like the Reverend Hicks never would segregate their churches. She never would segregate a church. That's why we made progress. Because the church has to stand for something different. So I learned about faith and activism and courage from my parents and my grandparents. And so they wanted me to be christened in the church my grandfather founded. And so I wasn't christened until we went back to Ghana. So I can actually remember being christened. Now, I wish I could tell you it was entirely a happy experience. But I am afraid it wasn't. It was very hot. The favorite son had come home with a white wife. Hold on. The church was packed. What did she look like? Because it wasn't just in London that a mixed couple attracted stares. So the church was packed. It was very hot. And this is not apocryphal. The moment came when the minister, after quite a long sermon, spoke the words, "We deliver this child up to you, O God." This child heard those words and made a run for it. Absolutely true. Straight down, I had to be stopped. I was stopped, I was brought back. Well, I've stopped running now. I've stopped running now.